Thank you so much for joining us today as we welcome Rosie Turner, who's an accredited ADHD coach and the founder of ADHD Untangled. It's really great to have you here today, Rosie. Very much looking forward to this session. So for those of you who haven't joined a Live Talks before, my name's Gabby. I'm the head of partnerships at Live and I run the Live Talks program. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a white female with brown eyes, blonde tied back hair, and I'm wearing a kind of cream shirt with a blue top underneath it and gold rimmed glasses. Before I hand over to Rosie, I just need to go through a quick bit of housekeeping. Please note we are recording today's session to share online via our archive afterwards for those unable to join today. If you would rather remain anonymous, please feel free to keep your camera turned off and change your Zoom name to anonymous, but we would love for people to keep their cameras on. It's nice to see people's faces whilst we're doing the session. Please make sure your mic is muted throughout to avoid interference. And if we have some time left at the end, we'll open the floor to questions. But of course, as the session goes on, please feel free to put questions into the chat and we can raise them at the end. And that's it from me. Over to you, Rosie.
Thank you so much. I am really excited to be here today to talk all things ADHD from struggle to strength. So I always believe that ADHD will always be a bit of both. And the way that we can, concentrate more and focus more on the strengths is firstly by having awareness. And that is awareness that we may have a neurodivergence, and also for others to be aware of how that shows up for those individuals. So that's why I'm here today. And it's going to be very much about top line sharing today. So I'm going to try not to go into the depths of things today, just to start off with, sharing a real life ADHD story, because I believe that storytelling is so important, especially when it comes to differences, and also how it can impact us in the workplace. So all I ask for you today is, I know you're probably all here with like your work hats on because it's lunchtime and it's Monday, but just to come with like an open mind, an open heart, and maybe this talk could be the talk that brings you to your own awareness of your own different brain wiring, or enables you to understand someone that you know and love. I do have a little bit of a trigger warning that the stories that I will mention today do include mentions of suicide, addiction, and there might be a swear word or two. So up next is wins of the week. So obviously we don't have time to go through everyone's wins of the week, but I really like to start every session with this because whilst, every human has a stronger negative bias, those with ADHD are said to have an even stronger one. So I'm really big on reframing our, negative bias and trying to think of the things that are going well, as opposed to what we could be doing better and what isn't going well. So if you want to use the chat box, feel free to celebrate any wins of the week. I know it's only 12 o'clock on a Monday, so feel free to celebrate last week's wins and start to raise those vibes on a Monday afternoon. And another little note is I don't just get to talk about ADHD. I have ADHD and live with it day in, day out, which means I might forget, stumble over my words, and go off topic, and often talk very fast, as you may have guessed already. So today I plan to cover a little intro from me and what ADHD Untangled is, my own ADHD story of struggle to strength, and what is ADHD. So I'm just going to share some, I think important information that might help you understand what ADHD actually is and how it can, impact an individual's life. A little tiny section on ADHD and creativity, just because, many of you are in the music industry and there is a big correlation between ADHD and creativity. And then moving on to the struggles with ADHD in the workplace, and then the strengths and how we start to create a culture where everybody belongs. So this is me. And my name is Rosie Turner, as I mentioned, and I am the host and founder of ADHD Untangled, and most recently the ADHD Movement. And I'm an accredited ADHD coach, and I'm also a movement and meditation teacher. So I teach a little bit of yoga and Pilates here and there. And most importantly, I know what living with ADHD feels like. And some of you on this call may relate. My life has felt chaotic, to say the very least. And it's due to what I've described as having a tangled brain. And my family and friends now joke and say, well, you've always been a bit of a walking billboard for ADHD. So when I first got diagnosed in 2021, I was 32, it didn't really come as a surprise. But what I wasn't expecting was to learn that ADHD was so much more than I ever thought it was. And when I started to connect the dots, it explained a hell of a lot. So the 8 failed driving tests, my impulsive decision to get married and then divorce before the age of 27, and not to mention the many struggles I faced working in corporate environments and when it came to substance abuse. But most of all, it answered a question that I'd been asking myself my whole life, which was, what the hell is wrong with you? And so that is why I'm here today, because it was in that moment that I knew I wasn't alone. And I made a promise to myself that for the rest of my life, I am going to do every single thing I could to support our community, turn our story of struggle into a story of strength. And this is how I currently do that. So it started with the ADHD Untangled podcast, which I had no idea how to do. And I decided 2 weeks before and started recording literally 2 weeks after. And the first episode, I didn't turn the mic on, and I spent another 2 weeks hyper focusing, trying to still piece this episode together that didn't have much audio in it. But the reason for the podcast was when I got diagnosed and went on my own self-study, a lot of what I was hearing on podcasts was very insightful, but it was all telling me what I couldn't do. And there was not much talk about what we can do. And I'd met so many people with ADHD who had done amazing things with their lives, despite the struggles that they faced. So this podcast is all about sharing those stories to give our audience hope and empower them that despite the struggles they face, they can also go on to achieve great things. And then I became an accredited ADHD coach. So I studied with a company in America for 6 months. And now I'm running one-to-one coaching sessions, and we are just about to launch our first group coaching offer, which is in September. And then I do things like this. So talks and trainings for corporate companies, and soon to be training yoga teachers as well in neurodivergence. So lots of things going on. And charity events, which I will tell you about after. So I'm going to move on to my story now, and I'm going to try and keep it as short and what you need to know as possible. As I mentioned before, please be aware that there will be mentions of addiction and suicide to come. So storytelling, as I've mentioned, I believe is the most powerful thing we can do. And the reason I share my own story is to know that people that could be listening and watching, that they don't feel alone in their own struggle if they resonate with what I've been through in my life. So life untreated of ADHD, this is me as a child, and my sister Jessie is on there. She should be on this call somewhere, embarrassing her. But from the minute I entered the world, I was causing chaos. I was a very hyperactive child, and I was walking by the time I was 9 months. And I really didn't have any patience for crawling, my mum said. And I'd broken my arm twice and dislocated it once before the age of 3. So, to say the least, I was hyperactive. But that ADHD rebellion was deep-rooted in me from the very start, because the cast that they first put on my arm, I kept smashing off on the side of my cot. And my dad said he spent a week up the hospital getting the cast put back on until eventually they put it so high up into my shoulder so I couldn't get it off anymore. But overall, I was an energetic, curious child, and that child at a party that'd be running around, grabbing all the sweets, wanting to be friends with everybody. and wanting to be liked and loved by everybody. But I'd always tend to get myself in some kind of trouble. And my dad's friends used to nickname me Grounded because I'd always be grounded and, being punished to not go out because I'd done something wrong. And I'd always be getting detention in school. And my dad now says to me, he believes the reason he went bald so young was because of me. But on a more serious note, I was always told to calm down. Well, why can't you just do as you're told? Why are you always causing a scene? Always making life so hard for yourself? Can't you just be well behaved like everyone else? And my school reports always said I had the potential, but I was way too easily distracted, and worse, distracting others. And these struggles to conform led me to believe who I was wasn't good enough. And who I was wrong, bad, and naughty. And unfortunately, this isn't unique to my story. As it is said, individuals with ADHD on average receive 20,000 more negative comments and criticism by the time they are 12 years old than a neurotypical child. This is why in the community that I work in every day with clients and on my podcast, that lack of self-belief is rife. It is hardwired in our brains to believe who we are is not enough. And this, to me, is the most detrimental struggle that we face. And as life went on, things didn't really change, but the impacts were a lot more serious. And I described this decade, which was like my late teens and my 20s, as the decade of seeking. And I was seeking more love, more experiences, more achievement. And my brain wanted to do it all and do it all at once. I didn't know who I was or what I wanted. So I was just abandoning my own identity to fit in and do what everyone else was doing around me, in the hope that something would eventually work and I'd start to feel normal and be able to be like everyone else. But nothing ever did. And anything I accomplished never felt enough anyway. And I just spent my life going from one extreme to the other. And none of it brought me to the place of peace that I was so desperate to find. But I did have a lot of fun. And I was always chasing some kind of high, whether it was the next night out, next new job for a well-known brand, the next bucket list trip, or my next whirlwind relationship. And from the outside, I was someone who was seen to be doing it all and being it all. And I did have some incredible experience that have really shaped me to be the person I am today, and ones I'm very grateful for. But my need to chase highs led me to chase those highs in all the wrong places, which led me to have a real problem with alcohol and drugs and entertain toxic relationships, but also leave the good relationships. I just had this feeling of being restless, lost, and confused. But one thing was certain, I always felt different. Everybody around me could hold down jobs, relationships. They could manage their drinking. They could manage their finances and just organize their life. But I couldn't. And why couldn't I do these things is what I used to always ask. Why do I just keep making life hard for myself and messing stuff up? And this is what eventually took me to some really dark places mentally and what almost cost me my life. But then something changed. I lost a friend to his own mental health struggles. And before he passed, he signed me up to the London Marathon. And it was a bit of a joke because there was no way I was fit enough to run a marathon. I was too busy drinking at lunchtime and smoking 20 Marlboro Light every night, But when he passed, I almost felt like it was in his honor, like a need to run this marathon now. It meant something completely different. So I thought, right, I'm going to do this. And my sister, bless her, joined me on this challenge. And, I was by no means any better with like drinking and, going out at this point. But we slowly started to train. And we worked at the same place. So we'd run to work at least once a week. And we had like a personal trainer to help us once a week. And I did start to notice some slight shifts. I was more productive, had a bit more clarity. I was making some slightly better decisions, and I was getting less and less drawn to that party lifestyle. And once we had completed that marathon, I'd known that I didn't want to lose this feeling, that I was onto a good thing and I didn't want to let it go. And so I went on a make or break holiday with my current husband at the time, and I found a yoga studio. And I thought, right, I'm not going to drink for 2 weeks and I'm going to go yoga every morning while I'm here. And I did. And it completely changed every single thing. When I came home, I kept up my morning routine. I was hyper focused on yoga, and I'd left my marriage. And then only 8 months into my yoga journey, I decided, right, I'm going to go to India and I'm going to become a yoga teacher. And then I stopped partying. My addiction, it helped me overcome my addiction and change my whole entire life. But what it brought most was self-awareness, and especially to the struggles that I could no longer blame on my hangovers. Leaving car doors open, hobs on, losing my belongings constantly day in, day out. And still, despite all the meditation, all the yoga I was doing, really finding it hard to manage my emotions at times, especially to perceived rejection. And this is what led me to the missing piece of the puzzle, my ADHD diagnosis. And this changed everything. My relationships with my family are so much stronger. And not only because I understand myself more, but they can understand me more. My career has changed immensely. Like, I've run yoga retreats around the world. I've started a business from scratch. Things that I believed I could never, ever do. I felt useless. And, you know, every time I'd job hop or lose a job, I never thought I could achieve some of the stuff that I have since my diagnosis. And this proves that whilst the world will keep telling us what we can't do, we really can do amazing things, but it must start with awareness, and we must have support. But most importantly, ever since my diagnosis, I have not attempted or thought about taking my own life. And this is why diagnosis and awareness doesn't just change lives, it saves lives. So a little bit about what is ADHD. So I'm going to start with the official definition from the NHS, which really does not explain the complexities of what it's like living with ADHD. And I'll go into some more reasons why that is. It is said that the worldwide population, sorry for my little gap there, have a neurodivergence of 20% of us in the world, and 5% of those have ADHD. Now, I believe those numbers will be higher. And ADHD, whilst it seems like all of a sudden it's the new kid on the block and everyone's talking about it, it's been around and been mentioned since 1902. So why is it so misunderstood? Because we wasn't even aware or able to diagnose adults until 2008. We wasn't even aware or able to diagnose people in 2013, because we assumed that we grew out of it. And here's more about why the name doesn't really explain what ADHD actually is. It isn't just externalized hyperactivity. In fact, there's the inattentive side of ADHD, which some people only have. That is all internalized hyperactivity in the brain. So you wouldn't even know externally that they are hyperactive. It is 100% not a deficit of attention. In fact, it's an abundance of attention, and we just struggle to know where to channel it. It's not just behavior, it's very much emotions too. And especially when it comes, as I mentioned, to RSD, which is rejection sensitive dysphoria, and being able to manage those emotions. So going from really big highs to low lows. And it also very much focuses on a DESA-fit model and doesn't mention any of the strengths that can come from ADHD. And Dr. Ned Hallowell, who is a doctor who's been studying and working with ADHD for over 20 years, calls it the entrepreneur's trait, because we are 300% more likely to go and work for ourselves than those who don't have a neurodivergence. And disability versus mental health condition. So ADHD is now covered by the disability, I never get this name right. Oh, I can't say it. Equality, there we go, Act 2010. And it is not a mental health condition, but the comorbidities that come with ADHD are very much mental health conditions, because we've lived our whole life not knowing why we struggle. And I'll go into the stats around that shortly. But I know that everyone sort of always refers, a lot of people refer to ADHD as a mental health condition, and it is not. Now, here are the different types of ADHD. So we have the hyperactive and impulsive type. So this is the one that people are most aware of, right? This is like the naughty schoolboy stereotype, where we can't sit still, we might overtalk, we're sort of seen as being driven by a motor, and struggle with that self-control. And it is said that around 20% of people that are diagnosed with this type of ADHD. And then here we have the inattentive type. So this was previously known as ADD. And this is what I was talking about earlier, where it's very much internalized hyperactivity. They can be often seen as like the daydreamers, making the, careless mistakes, losing things quite often. And it is said that a lot of women and girls are diagnosed with this type. However, I don't like to assume that, because I'm not just inattentive, and I know many women that are not, but it is said that this type can be more prone to women than men. And then you've got the combined type. So this is where people demonstrate 6 or more symptoms of both inattentive or hyperactivity type. So this is 50% on average of people that get diagnosed will be combined. So that's quite a large percentage of people that are diagnosed with combined ADHD. So here's a little bit of science. Having ADHD means it is a neurodevelopmental disorder, which I prefer to call a difference. And this basically means that our brain is wired differently. So it isn't straightforward thinking, it's not linear, it's more out the box thinking. Now, this can cause us problems only because of the world that's set up for more straightforward thinking. And so the processes are done in different ways that our brain might want to do things, for instance. But the strength of this is we are always those out-the-box thinkers, creative problem solvers, which is why we can become really big assets to any company, because we can see things how others might not. Now, this one blew me away when I got diagnosed, and this is what explains so much in my life, and as you will see from my story as to why, but chemical imbalance. Now, we are said to have lower levels of dopamine in our brain. So dopamine being that reward chemical that we get from, you get from nicotine, you'll get from taking drugs, and, love and exercising and all of these things. Now, those individuals of ADHD hold lower amounts of dopamine. Therefore, our brain is constantly on the hunt for more of it, which explains why we lack in focus, because we are looking for our next hit of dopamine, why we are interest focused. So we have to do things that stimulate our brain, because our brain is understimulated. And hence why we see so many of us chasing those highs, whether that be work highs, whether that be substance highs, love highs, whatever it is, we are always looking for more. This was like the big one for me. And then lastly, I wanted to share was our 30% developmental delay in executive function. So I'm sure most of you will know where the executive function is, just in case. It's the front part of our brain, which we call the CEO of our brain. So it's responsible for our cognitive processes, right? So here we have working memory, emotional regulation, goal-directed behavior. Now, if this is impacted in a neurodivergent, so someone with ADHD, this is why we see us forget important dates, lose our belongings, suffer with time blindness, suffer with our extreme emotions, being highly sensitive, and also why we often know what it is we want to do, but we can't break down the steps to get there. And this is why people really benefit from coaching, because coaching can really help them work out what those steps are. So these things can feel so big to us because we just don't know where the first step is and how to process how to get there. So I want to note that all of these, what I've mentioned, is just to the fact of what society upholds to normative standards. And they are simply just differences. And as I've mentioned many times, there is a lot of positives to thinking differently, which we'll cover more on later. However, it's important to note that I think, especially in the workplace, is where we find these differences can cause us many, many challenges. So what is the cost of untreated ADHD? So here are some stats on addiction, which is 5 to 10 times more likely to struggle with substance abuse than those without ADHD. Huge. Mental health, this one makes my blood boil and also gives me goosebumps every time I say it. But adults with ADHD are 5 times more likely to take their own life. And our life expectancy, on average, we lose around 13 years. And that can be due to the above reasons, but also accidents and things like that. So many different reasons that can happen. And the workplace stats are that we lose around 22 days in productivity each year. And we are 60% more likely to be fired and 30% more likely to have ongoing chronic employment issues and 3 times more likely to quit on impulse. So how do we spot the ADHD in the workplace? So this is very top line, and obviously when I go into more like trainings and stuff, it's much more deeper, but I just wanted to give you some top line information. So self-awareness comes with that 30% developmental delay, which means we can often be very much focused on what's happening now. If it's not, it's like now or never. And that means we may forget to take breaks, so leave the desk and do what it is we need to do for self-care. We might overtalk or talk very fast and not realize it and interrupt people. And this is what makes us very much a human doing and not a human being. Now, there is strength in this when it comes to the workplace, because this now or never kind of thinking can mean we can perform exceptionally well, especially when it's something that we are really into and our brain's stimulated by, and support others really well. But it can have detrimental effects, such as burnout and, mental health struggles, because we have not looked after ourselves. So the key here is really about finding balance and bringing that awareness to the forefront that that's what we're doing, and why our brain's doing it. So working memories, these might be quite obvious ones. So with disorganization, missing deadlines, and forgetting what's been said and what they've agreed to can happen quite a lot. And I've put here late to meetings, but also you might notice that someone is often quite early to meetings who has ADHD, because they have this constant fear that they are going to be late. So they cannot think about anything else until that big meeting or that big commitment has happened. So they might even be there really early, just waiting for it to start, because they are so worried that they're going to be late. Emotional dysregulation. So what there's obviously a lot on here, like overwhelm and fear of getting it wrong. But what I want to talk about mainly here is something called RSD. So this is a sensitivity to criticism, for instance. Now, rejection sensitive dysphoria is said to be one of the most painful things that comes from having ADHD. And I've not met anybody that hasn't suffered from rejection sensitive dysphoria who has come into my clinic. Now, this means we are very sensitive to perceived and real rejection. So if you think about this in a workplace, for instance, my boss would put a meeting in saying, quick catch up tomorrow, no title or agenda of what it was. I would go home that night and be convinced that that meeting was a meeting about me getting sacked or something really negative happening, not sleeping, and can be being totally paranoid by it and consuming my whole entire evening. It could also be when we're giving feedback. So you could give us the best feedback and say we're doing really well, but that one bit of negative feedback will completely floor us, and that is all we will focus on. So this is how it might come across of an individual in the workplace when they're receiving that feedback, or they feel like they're being left out of projects and they're taking it really sensitively. So this is quite a big one to pick up on, because we can't just switch it off. It doesn't matter if we're at work, at home, and we shouldn't have to switch it off. But I think if the individual can become aware of why they're so sensitive, like that has completely changed my life, and then others know that, then there's really great ways to work that out, communicate and start to collaborate on things and how we can, avoid these moments of RSD. So all of these struggles can lead to having a feeling of a lack of purpose, especially if we're job hopping, never reaching our full potential. Burnout is huge for our community. And as I've mentioned, struggles with mental health. This is why it's so important. But I do believe that individuals with ADHD are destined for greatness. And here's a few of our strengths. So obviously there's many more, but as you can see, there's many strengths here that would make us such great assets to any company and any type of work we go on to do. I want to talk a little bit about creativity, because it is said that we are more creative. We tend to be more creative than those who don't have divergent ways of thinking. And we tend to go off the beaten path and think outside the box, sort of like free thinking. And in my opinion, we really need creative outlets as ADHDers, whatever that may be. And it may not be artistic creativity. It could be this problem solving, making things and, innovation. But I think it's very meaningful to us. And I think I really notice it in a client if they haven't got that creative outlet, the difference in their energy. Now, I'm using music artists as my example today. Now, these three musicians have in common ADHD. And it's no surprise to me that we see so many musicians and creatives now coming out to say they have ADHD. And I think it's a very exciting thing, because in the day-to-day world, the ordinary world, difference has a real strong negative connotation still. However, I think when we look at creative industries, to be different and individual can be more embraced and actually maybe even admired at times, which is why I believe that the creative industries, and especially the music industry, is a very exciting place to start creating that influence to the rest of the world, that the importance of embracing difference. And when the world keeps telling us what we can't do, and let you guys, or the music industry itself, be the people to show that with the right support, finding what we love to do, which is so important for our brain, and the freedom to embrace our differences, we can and we will achieve great things. And here's a little quote from Dr. Liz Hallowell. So what is creativity after all but impulsivity gone right? So how do we create a culture where everyone belongs? So I'm going to keep this very short. So I want to start with the why. So someone asked me a while ago about how would I explain ADHD to an alien if they came down, right? So here's my little example, and then I'm going to relate it to Ed Sheeran. So imagine there are two kinds of brains. People with ADHD have a different kind of brain wiring. However, their unique wiring isn't always understood and doesn't quite fit into the system and the world around them. And what can happen is these remarkable strengths can easily start to transform into detrimental challenges. And what tends to happen is those living with ADHD might spend a long time trying their best to fit into the world, tirelessly trying to fit into that world, which can then feel like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. And if we can think about it like this, The multi-million selling solo artist, Ed Sheeran, as you could see, was constantly rejected by record labels because they said he was slightly chubby and ginger and wasn't a good marketing tool for them. But how wrong were they? He went on to achieve 6 UK #1 albums, 7 Brit Awards, and 14 UK #1 singles, and so much more. So, in my view, ADHD is like that hidden star musician with potential fighting to break free and light up the world with their amazing gifts and talents. But they are just desperately trying to seek that right manager, that right label, and that right stage to unleash their brilliance and really reach the pinnacle of their greatness. And it is no different for people with ADHD in any business or any workforce. We need to give them the right environment, the right support, and then they can become some of these businesses and companies' biggest assets. So working together with an individual who may be different is really the difference between seeing someone suffer in silence and underperform or thrive and become that greatness that they truly are within them. So explanation, not an excuse. We hear a lot about ADHD being an excuse. And I don't believe that. I believe ADHD is an explanation. Now we have an explanation as to why we might struggle or why our brain works in the way it does. Then we all need to work together and really work out, how do we now thrive with what we have and do the best with what we have? And that starts with trust. We want a safe space to be who we really are. Because guess what? When we feel safe, we perform better. We feel able to go and do the things that we are great at because we're not in that fight or flight response and trying to mask so hard to hide who it is that we are. I was going to share a little bit around as a company what you could do, and you can take inspiration from this no matter where you are and where you work. But first and foremost is awareness versus action. Now, this is great, attending talks like this and, doing your bit to become aware. But obviously, it really starts with taking action. Once you have, learned the knowledge, you've understood a little bit more about these differences. How are you going to take those small steps to create actual change? Now, someone who's doing it really well, and I just while I was researching for this talk, found this out, is David Joseph. So he's the CEO of Universal Music UK. Now he connected the dots and realized that many of his artists were displaying symptoms of ADHD. And he thought, well, what about the people that are supporting these artists? What about the people within the workplace at Universal? And he really took action. He started to run workshops, do research focus sessions with the company, and even made connections with leading academics and interviewed multiple neurodivergent individuals about their experiences with a goal to learn if their current recruitment process and also the staff development processes were accommodating enough to ensure, in his own words, that these neurodivergent individuals could be the best versions of themselves. Now, this resulted in recommendations that are now printed within the company's creative differences guidelines with the neurodivergent specific reasonable adjustments. Now, this is amazing. And I want to show you and share some of the examples of what they did and also add my own. So hiring process. From the very start, this is where we want to go. So application process now at Universal, they offer audio or video submissions as well as written ones. This is brilliant. It's such a small step, small change that costs nothing, and is so opening and welcoming to so many different people. There's other things like having an ADHD tick box. So we often have tick boxes of, do you have a disability or a mental health condition? However, some people with ADHD may not see their ADHD as a disability, or they won't see it as a mental health condition. So having that specific box just enables people to know that you really are open and welcoming to differences. Also sharing your neurodivergent policies next to your job apps. Now, interviews. Universal are now offering quiet spaces for interviews, additional time to prepare for interview questions, and they have been considering whether tests are strictly necessary for the roles that they do offer tests for, right? Other things that I've seen companies do are send questions before interviews, which is really good for neurodivergence, and also allow fidget toys. So fidget toys for stimming in interviews. Probation period. So this one I added in because probation is always a stressful time for anybody. But in my experience with my clients, it is even more so. And what happens is so many of them don't even tell their employer till after. And this makes them so vulnerable because there can be so many misunderstandings, right, in that time that could be related to their ADHD and could be avoided. So, you know, step one with the application and interview processing is, you know, making them feel comfortable to disclose. And that does happen from the very start of how you promote your jobs, you know, how you make them accommodating in those interviews, and just showing that you're a company that really, really does support neurodivergence. Having clear messaging on what support you do offer these individuals. So there's obviously access to work, which I'll cover later, which is a government fund for those in the workplace. So maybe showing, you know, the information to receive your grant or how to get your grant, and what it is you do on top of that as a company. Set them up for success. What tools do they need to pass probation? And inductions and trainings. How can we make these more neurodivergent friendly? Remember that some people might not like reading. Some people may not be able to sit still all day and do an induction video. How can we make that onboarding process a lot more ADHD friendly? Having clear expectations, like being clear on what is expected of them in the next 3 months, setting those small goals along the way. And most importantly, human-human connection. So those check-ins, working together, collaborating. So reasonable adjustments. So obviously reasonable adjustments are there to help people work in the environments the best they can and do their job effectively. Now, most companies, when I go in, the first thing they think is, oh, we're going to have to rip up the books, and, you know, it's going to take us so much time to do all these changes, and it's going to cost us loads of money. And what they're always surprised by is the fact how opposite that is. So the majority of the adjustments should be able to be done very simply and quickly. And the average cost of a reasonable adjustment is £75. And the majority of the adjustments I have seen from our clients actually cost nothing. And the most expensive ones, which is ADHD coaching, for instance, can be supported by access to work. You know, supporting individuals with reasonable adjustments is all about just creating a more collaborative, inclusive, and effective working environment for all. That is all a reasonable adjustment is. And I think sometimes we hear that and it feels very legal and very serious, when it is just about working together and how do we enable you to thrive. I like to use this little example of a houseplant. So individuals with ADHD, especially late diagnosed ADHDers, tend to not always know what support they might need. But it's like a houseplant, right? If a houseplant is starting to look a bit like it's going to kill over, it can't tell us what's wrong. But we wouldn't just chuck it away. We'd try and give it more water or less sunlight or more sunlight until we figured it out, and we'd figure it out together despite not being told exactly what the plant needs. And that is exactly how it is with an individual with ADHD in the workplace, when they are just figuring out what their struggles are, because often they don't know what's their ADHD and what's them, and what support that means they need yet. So it's all about asking questions and figuring it out together. And this is access to work, in case none of you are aware of this, but those of individuals with ADHD who are in work can get support with ADHD coaching, any practical supports like desks and various things like that, any software, and and it's a great offering. There is a big waiting list, but you're usually reimbursed once you get through, so from the day that you apply. And I've got a free video on my hub, like a workshop that takes people through the form, and can support individuals in applying for that grant. Other things that you can do are workplace trainings. A lot of people are doing ADHD champions now. So a bit like where we have mental health first aiders, we're having ADHD champions, lunch and learn. So if anyone's got ADHD in your company or in your communities, you know, doing lunch and learns, people sharing their stories, neurodivergent representations, leaders that are diagnosed with, you know, ADHD or autism to, you know, be showing their own neurodivergence and differences is very, very powerful. And creating community. So whether that's in, you know, Slack channels or again, like supports, having support groups and things like that. However you want to grow your own community within your workplace, but community is everything when these people have felt alone the majority of their lives. A quote from me. And lastly, I just want to leave you with a little note from the wonderful Professor James Brown, who came on the podcast. For any of you that need to hear this.
If you've grown up for years hating yourself and feeling like you're less, accept that you're enough. You are enough. You have got to where you are in life despite starting further down the ladder, despite having this neurodevelopmental disorder. You've got to where you are, and that means by default you're a fucking fighter. Even if you, like I did for years and still do a lot, just instantly default to low self-esteem and you're rubbish, just remember you're wonderful and you're beautiful. Even if you're beautifully imperfect, you're beautiful. If you've grown up for years hating.
And this is where you can find me. So here's the free hub, ADHD hub. So you can use that QR code or find us on all of these links here. So Instagram, LinkedIn, and our website. There's lots of free resources there to educate you, to empower you. And it's a real work in progress, but this is our first draft of it and people are really getting a lot from it. So I hope it really helps. It even has things like if you want to go for a private diagnosis because you can't wait on, you know, don't want to go on the waiting list, we've got some recommendations there, and that access to workshops available on there. I am also getting 20 ADHDers to cycle from London to Amsterdam in aid of 2 amazing ADHD charities in September. So if you want to sponsor us, you can. And that's it from me, really. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosie. That was brilliant. I've definitely learned a lot.
Have you? Good.
Yeah, so much. That was so useful. Does anyone have any questions for Rosie? If you either want to raise your hand or pop it in the chat. I know we had one person put an example of what they'd gone through. Alex in the chat earlier said, I was particularly disturbed when I found out autism and ADHD couldn't be diagnosed together until 2013.
Yeah, massive shock.
Yeah, he said Alex was diagnosed with autism as a 5-year-old in 2005 and ADHD 18 years later last year. Went through their life thinking a lot of their ADHD was down to autism, whereas a lot of them are actually caused by ADHD.
Wow.
Thank you.
This is it. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that.
There's lots and lots of love coming through on the chat, lots of thank yous. I'm just trying to scroll to see if there's any questions.
Oh, thank you, guys.
This is so interesting. It was brilliant, super beneficial. Definitely need more check-ins in the workplace. Arish has asked, can you please give us more examples of what the company can do for people with ADHD? Is there any kind of additional things you'd suggest, Rosie?
Yeah, so obviously I said this is because it's top line, but I mean, obviously there is workplace trainings that are really good, and having those people within the company, maybe people that have got the, you know, ADHD or neurodivergence themselves, has representations to talk to the individuals, because I think what we're finding is we find it really hard at first, especially to open up to others who don't really understand what it is we're going through. So I think having representation is number one. Asking questions is also very powerful as a manager. just asking questions. As I said, they may not always know, but the more you can ask questions in what support do you need? Why do you struggle? What, where do you struggle? How could we help? And then them working out how they can help themselves as well. There's something that I do called a Thrive plan, so an ADHD Thrive plan, and that's what we use with the managers to go through people's struggles when they've just been diagnosed or they've just declared that they've got ADHD, to go through their role and how ADHD might impact that and what we can do to support them. And I think just showing, that you're there for them and you're trying to understand, and education is so important, right? So listening to whatever you can. There's an online magazine called Attitude is amazing. And they also have a podcast. There's a book called ADHD 2.0, which is by Dr. Ned Hallowell. And I just think it's education. And again, remembering that people with ADHD, yes, we will present similar traits, but we also, when you've met one person with ADHD, you've met one person with ADHD. So it can still show up individual within each person. So that's why I say it is about conversations and it is about collaboration, because it really depends on that individual and what they're doing, how it will show up. So there's not just like a one size fits all. And also depending on where the company's at as well. So a lot of the companies I work with, I'll look at their values and also what else they do at the moment to support other diversities. So it's very individual to companies and that person. But I think start asking questions and look and being open and understanding, having that approach to understand.
Brilliant. Natalie's asked, what are the benefits of getting an official diagnosis? It seems very hard to get one with long waiting lists.
Yeah, and this is the thing, like we always say, like self-diagnosis is as valid, and there's a lot of good self-diagnosis, official self-diagnosis platforms out there, which again is on the hub. But it depends on you as a person why you would need that, and if you feel you need that. Some people that I meet with ADHD, they feel they need that official diagnosis because of the self-doubt, because they're like, well, what if it's not it? And I'm just making up an excuse, and I am really just lazy, or I am just chaotic, and it is all my fault. We have this, again, like I mentioned earlier, this lack of self-belief in ourselves. Even when we get our official diagnosis, I have people come and say that to me, because we just don't believe that there is an answer for why we're struggling. But I always say the waiting lists are long, and if you relate and resonate with symptoms of ADHD and you've been, researching into it, then take that as you have it. You and you know your life and your own struggles more than anybody else. Start treating yourself as if you have ADHD. There is no harm in, having support or working with your brain and learning different ways of how your brain works and how to support you in thriving. So I would say take the answer as, you've got it. If you have that intuitive, feeling that you have, then believe it, trust it, go with it. Don't wait for the GPs who actually probably know a lot less than you do about what it's like to live with ADHD to tell you.